Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, movie review. So this is a German movie, filmed in German language, but you can get it with subtitles, of course. If you don't know what it's a true story about a Sophie Scholl, who was a 21-year-old university student in Nazi Germany. And she and her brother and one of their other friends were caught distributing anti-Nazi leaflets in the university. They were caught by the Gestapo. They were convicted in a Nazi court, and then they were guillotined, like straight after. So it's a story of a martyr, essentially. It's a story of a 21-year-old girl who was saying what the Nazis were doing was wrong, and they guillotined her for it. I'm going to go on a little bit of a digression here to maybe put this historical episode or movies like this in context by talking about a lecture I remember from university. So I was taking a course on the teaching of history. Back in my college days, I was a history education major. So I was training to become a high school history teacher back in college. And one of the courses we had to take was about the teaching of history and talking about the different issues bound up with teaching history to high school students. And the professor was talking about an incident. He had been teaching about the Salem witchcraft trials to like a freshman college class. And he said one of the students had written back in her feedback essay, they had to write essays on this. One of the freshman students had written an essay, and at the bottom of the essay, she apparently said, it's terrible, it's horrible what happened at the Salem witchcraft trials, but if I had been alive back then, I'm sure I would have done the same thing. And my professor was actually really upset about this. I remember him being kind of visibly upset that a student would write this. And he said to us, what do you do with a student who writes this, or how do you respond to this? And I thought this was interesting because I had always thought, well, not always, but maybe you get to a certain point in life. Let me start over. When you're young and you learn about the injustices in history, right? Like the slave trade and slavery and racism and stuff like that, you think, that's terrible. If I had been alive back then, I would have spoken out against it. I would have tried to stop it. Because you have this view of yourself as being outside of the forces of history, right? You have this view of yourself as being a moral person who is not influenced by historical circumstances or the people around you or any of that kind of stuff. That's kind of like a child's view of history. As you get older, you start to kind of realize that you do not stand outside of the stream of history. You are influenced by the values of the society you grew up in. Just like the people who were involved in the slave trade arguably didn't see anything wrong with what they were doing because of the culture they had grown up in. You are arguably blind to the evils that are going on in our society just because you've grown up in it and you've been acculturated to think it's normal. And who knows, maybe in 500 years, they're going to look back on it and they're going to say, oh, those awful people in the 21st century, look at all the terrible stuff they did. And it might be stuff that's not even on our radar right now, right? Stuff we're not even thinking about. And I always thought, well, not always, but again, once I got to a certain age, I began to think that that's more kind of the sophisticated view of history, is to recognize that we are influenced by history, maybe even kind of trapped in history. And I even thought maybe this is kind of a progressive view, because if you take the attitude, once you realize that you have the potential to be influenced by the culture around you, and that future historians might condemn our culture for things that we're not even thinking about, then that might cause you to kind of more critically examine what's going on and to try and kind of make sure you're on the right side of history. So we were having the in-class discussion, and I raised my hand, and I said something to the effect of that. I said, I said essentially what I just got done saying. Maybe not quite so rambling, but I made that point in some form in the class. And the professor said, yeah, but, he said, okay, I understand what you're saying, but there's another extreme you can go to, which is to act like in any given age, people were kind of powerless against the tide of history. But in reality, there was not like this just kind of blind acceptance of any of these injustices. You can go to any period of history you want, arguably, and there will be people standing up against the injustices. So, for example, you can't say like, well, slavery was awful, but, in the 1700s, everybody thought it was okay. Because actually, if you go back and you kind of really study that historical period, everybody did not think it was okay. Like, even in the American South, in like 1800, there were people who were speaking out against slavery. There were, white people who had grown up in the culture who were saying, no, this is wrong. I'm using slavery as an example, but just kind of any historical injustice. There were always people who were standing up against it. Now, the context of this discussion, actually, we were talking about a book called Lies My History Teacher Told Me by James Lewin. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Loewen. Which was one of the assigned books we were reading for that class. We actually didn't read the whole thing. We read sections of it. But the sections that we read were fascinating. And I highly recommend this book if you can track it down. I think it's gone through several editions. This book is written by a former American high school history teacher who's kind of gone through and examined all the textbooks involved in the American, used in American public schools, and kind of highlighted what they were leaving out and what they were saying that arguably wasn't true. Hence the title, Lies My History Teacher Told Me. And one of the things that he highlighted, he's got a whole chapter on the disappearance of anti-racism from the history textbooks. So in other words, we kind of think, back then everybody was racist. But that's not true. There were people who were, even way back then, even in the American South, even before the Civil War, there were people who were anti-slavery and who were fighting against the injustice of their time. And the danger is if you take that out of the history textbooks, there's a couple dangers. One is you kind of send the message to people that they are powerless against kind of the forces of history, or that you just kind of have to accept what's going on in your time, which you don't. But the other thing is, if you take that out, you're kind of erasing the culpability for the people who are involved in it. You're kind of saying, well, the slave owners, okay, that's not great, but they didn't know any better. It was way back then. Everybody did it. And as soon as you say that, then you're kind of letting them off the hook. Whereas the message was, no, these people do not get let off the hook. Everybody did not think it was okay. There were people speaking out against them at the time, and they made the choice to endorse slavery or to be slave owners. They could have gone to the other side, right? So yeah, So by getting rid of kind of the anti-racism or kind of smoothing out the corners of history like this, you're actually kind of letting these people off the hook for what they had done. So that discussion has stayed in my mind for years afterwards, obviously. And I thought about this when I was watching the movie, Sophie Scholl, The Final Days. Because I thought, this is arguably the kind of movie we need more of. Because it shows that, not everybody in Nazi Germany was just kind of like, well, what can you do? We're just kind of prisoners of historical circumstances. People made choices. And Sophie Scholl, who was only 21 years old, chose to stand against the Nazis. And they killed her for it, but that's a choice that she made. And by emphasizing her story, it puts more culpability on all the other thousands or millions of Germans who either joined the Nazis or were just quiet about it. Just said, okay, I don't want to get in any trouble, just leave me out of it. The amount of courage, going back into the movie, the amount of courage Sophie Scholl showed is just amazing. It's a really well done movie. If you know me, you know that I really hate anything melodramatic or sappy or kind of overly emotional. But I thought that this film managed to be extremely powerful without being overly emotional. In fact, hands down, easily one of the best films I've seen ever. I recommend it. While I'm on the subject, a good point of comparison, another film to compare it to, is Judgment at Nuremberg, which is an old film. I think it came out in 1961. It's an American film. It's in black and white. It's fictionalized, so it's not. It's a story of the trials at Nuremberg, but it's a trials of kind of the minor war criminals. So after they've gotten all the big guys, now they're going after the second tier people. So these wouldn't have been the Nazi leaders, but these would have been judges and court judges and politicians and stuff like that, administrators, police chiefs in kind of the Nazi regime. I think that actually the guy was one of the judges. He was not one of the high judges, but one of the court judges who was part of the Nazi regime, but not one of the top criminals. And college professors, judges and college professors who had been part of the Nazi machine. And there's an opening speech right in the beginning of the film where they say, these guys, these were not like Hitler Youth, like these young people who got brainwashed by the Nazis. These were people who should have been old enough to know better. These were the leaders of society when the Nazis came into power. And they were good people, arguably, but they allowed themselves to be corrupted by the Nazi regime. It's a good film, Judgment at Nuremberg, if you can track it down and watch it. It's worth watching. I bring that up by a point of comparison because after you watch that film, which is fictionalized, but it was talking about a real event, which was kind of the trials at Nuremberg, where these college professors and judges who were in the similar situations were put on trial. It gives you all the more appreciation for Sophie Scholl. Here was this 21-year-old college student in a country when all the judges, the professors, the civic and religious leaders, not all of them obviously, but a lot of them, people old enough to know better, had aligned with the Nazi party, and then here's this young girl who just said no. The movie makes a big point of Sophie Scholl's Christian faith. And I thought it was appropriate because, her story kind of plays out almost like something out of the Old Testament, right? You remember these Old Testament stories? Like the nation of Israel had gone astray. all the kings and religious leaders and judges of the law courts and all the people who should know better have all kind of gone astray and kind of forsaken their moral duty. And so then God just kind of raises up this obscure shepherd boy and said, okay, you are going to carry my message. I thought maybe there was a little parallel here where in Nazi Germany, well, again, it's an exaggeration to say all because it's complicated, isn't it? There were older people who stood up against the Nazis as well. But once the Nazis had kind of stamped those people out, you had this regime where all these people who should have been old enough to know better are going along with it. And then, yeah, just like the Old Testament prophets get chosen from obscurity by God, this 21-year-old girl has the courage to say no to it. Sorry, actually, I'm probably undermining my own point by kind of overemphasizing the uniqueness of Sophie Scholl and saying, like, she was the only one. That undercuts the point I was trying to make earlier, which is that she wasn't the only one. There were lots of other people against it. But it still does, people like her kind of increase the culpability of all the other people who should have been old enough to know better. Anyways, fascinating film. Can't recommend it enough. If you can find it in your local video store or on the internet or whatever, definitely give it a watch.